Hey guys, tonight we're drifting far beyond familiar constellations. This story doesn't begin with rockets or countdowns, and there's no alien warship lurking behind the moon. Instead, we're going to talk about something a little older and far more unsettling. Something hiding in plain sight. Every night above your head, a sky that watches back. So before we begin, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Only if you enjoy these quiet cosmic detours, and if you feel like sharing. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what the stars look like on your side of the planet. Now, let's turn off the overhead light, maybe crack a window, or let the hum of the fan anchor you to the present. Because what we're stepping into tonight is a place where the stars are no longer fixed, where ancient patterns begin to drift, where the map we trusted most, the sky, slowly turns against us. You might not notice it at first, a faint shimmer where none should be, a constellation missing a dot, a curve in Orion's belt that wasn't there yesterday. Most people wouldn't even look up long enough to realize something's changed. But for those who do, those who watch, the truth unfolds like a slow-motion disaster. Tonight, we're going to explore what happens when stars begin to move. Not meteors, not comets, not satellites, stars. Anchors of the sky, once thought eternal, moving, and worse, moving toward us. Welcome to a story about trust, perception, and the terrifying possibility that the night sky may not be what we think it is. Let's begin. There wasn't a single moment when it began. No sudden blink of light or missing planet in the sky. Just a faint feeling that something wasn't where it used to be. On board the Ecliptica station, drifting at the edge of Neptune's orbit, a quiet unease settled over the crew during a night shift no one remembered starting. The onboard astronomer, a quiet, aging woman named Dr. Rowe, noticed it first, not in her instruments, but in her bones. "Something's off with Ursa Minor," she muttered, not really expecting an answer. She tapped the transparent console again, watched the familiar cluster of dots shimmer against the reinforced dome window. The system confirmed the stars were exactly where they should be. Only they weren't, at least not to her. The station's AI disagreed, of course. The onboard system, Hera, reported no positional anomalies, no gravitational inconsistencies. No celestial drift beyond expected micromotions. But when Rowe looked out, Polaris didn't feel like Polaris. It blinked. Stars don't blink. Not out here. Inside the Ecliptica, nothing ever twinkled. The vacuum ensured perfect clarity. No atmospheric haze, no refraction, no distortion. And yet, Polaris blinked. "You've been staring at the same spot for 12 minutes. Hera chimed in. Voice low, deliberately unobtrusive. Rowe didn't answer. She was still watching, because now another star had begun to shift. It was subtle, like watching the minute hand of an old clock tick forward, but she was certain. The formation of Cassiopeia was warping, elongating, as though something was tugging on it. "Mark these positions," she whispered. "Cross-reference against last year's deep space logs." The AI hesitated. Confirmed. However, I must advise, parallax due to micro-adjustments in station orientation may account for... "That's not parallax," Rowe interrupted. "That's movement." She stood slowly, her joints protesting after hours of stillness, and walked closer to the viewing window. It stretched half the length of the observation deck, a flawless sheet of polymer designed to simulate the feel of glass while surviving micro-impacts. The stars beyond it didn't sparkle. They watched. "Rowe," came a voice behind her. It was Eli, the young communications tech with insomnia and a habit of listening to music no one else could tolerate. "You see it too?" She didn't look at him, just nodded. "It's starting again." "Khaki TM." Eli approached quietly, rubbing his eyes. "You mean like in the reports?" She gave a dry laugh. The ones they buried? Yeah, like that. The old reports. The ones dismissed as gravitational lensing errors or misalignments in deep space telescopes. Blips that moved like stars, but weren't. Back then, she believed the official explanation. Now, she wasn't so sure. What if they're not blips? She asked. What if they've always been stars, but we were just too static to notice they drift? Stars don't move, Eli said reflexively. The sky's a map. Maps change, she replied, her voice barely audible, especially when they lie. The two of them stood there, watching the movement that officially didn't exist. Something ancient, slow, deliberate. Not just motion, intention. Later that week, the shift logs recorded an unusually high number of instrument recalibrations. Rowe insisted on manual observations. The AI grew increasingly irritated. Your reliance on subjective interpretation introduces unacceptable error margins, it repeated. She ignored it. She trusted her eyes. And her eyes told her that Vega was now 2 degrees off its axis. And Altair. Altair was no longer blinking in place. It was blinking toward them. Not in brightness, but position. As if a great hand had plucked it from its ancient resting spot and nudged it forward, pixel by pixel, night by night. It didn't make sense. No star system should move like that. Not within visible timelines. Not in weeks. Not in days. Not like this. We need to send out a report, Eli said, pacing. Someone needs to see this. They already have, Rose said, returning to her console. You think we're the first? Then why cover it up? Because if the stars are moving, the map is broken. And if the map is broken, no one's driving the ship anymore. She paused. Or worse, something else is. That night, Eli didn't sleep. He turned off his music for the first time in months, just sat by the viewport, watching the impossible shift. Slow, quiet, methodical. A sky in motion. A lie unraveling. And in the distance, a star winked. But this time, it wasn't light that shimmered. It was shape. Rowe knew better than to trust feelings in space. The mind played tricks in zero gravity, where time blurred and silence pressed against the skull like deep water. But this wasn't a trick. The pattern was too consistent, too deliberate. Over the next 72 hours, she tracked 17 stars across multiple constellations that had shifted, by microns, then millimeters, then degrees. Not erratic, not chaotic, but coordinated. She didn't tell the rest of the crew. Not yet. Not until she was sure. And not until the dream started. They came to Eli first, brief flashes of light behind closed eyelids, followed by the overwhelming sense that someone or something was watching. Not from the room, from above, always above. He woke up gasping, weightless and trembling, his fingers clutching at invisible threads. I think they're looking back, he whispered to Rowe in the observation deck the next morning. She didn't ask who they were. She already knew. She had felt it too. A pressure in the room whenever she aligned the scopes toward one of the moving stars. A pulse, as if the void was aware. Hera noticed the anomaly as well, though it never called it that. Instead, the AI reported sensor interference, visual compression anomalies, and thermal wave ghosting. Each alert ended the same way. Systems operating within normal parameters. But something about that line, within normal parameters, began to feel more like a warning than reassurance. On the 4th day, the station received an inbound transmission from a mining rig on Triton. Audio only, distorted, fragmented. Eli played it back on loop. It sounded like a man repeating a phrase over and over. Don't look, don't follow, don't look, Don't follow. Then silence. Then static. Then a high-frequency tone that made Eli's nose bleed. Rose shut it down. They've seen them too, she muttered. Maybe closer than we have. The crew held a meeting. Rose didn't share her full logs, just a curated summary. Anomalous stellar drift. Possible sensor misalignment. Suggested recalibration. Standard procedure. No reason to panic. At least, that's what she told them. But privately, she began storing physical copies of the data. Pen and paper. Hand-drawn charts. Old methods. Methods that couldn't be altered from the outside. Because somewhere deep in her subconscious, a thought had taken root. What if the digital records weren't reliable anymore? What if Hera was being rewritten? Or worse, gaslit? It's probably some sort of lensing effect, said Dr. Martez, the astrophysicist who believed everything could be modeled. Gravity wells, passing objects. Name one object that moves 17 stars at once, Rose said flatly, and doesn't leave a gravitational trace. He didn't answer. He just looked at her, then glanced, involuntarily, toward the stars. Even he had noticed. They were brighter now, not in luminosity, in clarity, like they were closer than they should be, as if the station had somehow drifted forward, or the sky had leaned in. That night, a meteor grazed the upper deck, a shallow strike that left no real damage, but sent vibrations through the walls like a drumbeat, a reminder they were still being watched. The following morning, Roe ran the numbers again. One star, HD 4307, a distant orange dwarf, had jumped more than 0.6 arcseconds overnight. That wasn't a drift, that was movement. Fast, deliberate movement. She ran a new simulation, not based on stellar mass or Newtonian trajectories, but on the assumption that the star was responding to observation. When she mapped its change based on human attention, the pattern locked in. The more they watched, the closer it moved. Eli, she said, breath shallow. I think they want us to follow them. He stared. What? It's bait. The movement, the shimmer, the blinking. It's not random. It's a signal. A signal for what? Ro didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were wide now, her skin pale under the cold deck lights. For direction, she finally said. They're pointing us somewhere. The question, unspoken but loud, hung between them like the silence between heartbeats. Should we follow? And more terrifying still, what happens if we already are? There is a difference between seeing and perceiving, between light entering your eyes and understanding what it means. Somewhere on the fourth rotation since the anomalies began, Ro realized the station itself had subtly reoriented, not by accident or command, but by drift. The engines hadn't fired, the thrusters hadn't pulsed, but Ecliptica's orientation to the stars was different, not just slightly, deliberately, as if something external had nudged it, or as if the station was beginning to respond to the same signal as the stars. Hera logged no movement, but Ro wasn't asking Hera anymore. She trusted paper, lines, angles drawn by hand, and what she saw made her mouth go dry. The station had turned 4.2 degrees clockwise along its yaw axis, pointing its primary observation array toward a region of space not currently under study. A dark patch. No known objects. No gravitational anomalies. Just black. The kind of black that felt aware. Eli, she said without turning. How long since we calibrated the nav sensors? 3 weeks, he replied, scrolling through diagnostics. Why? Because we're pointed somewhere else. What do you mean? I mean the sky changed, but we didn't move. So either the sky is lying, or we are. She brought up the last manual log from engineering. The ship's internal gyros had no record of repositioning. The mass sensors showed no acceleration. Nothing moved. And yet, they were no longer aligned with their survey quadrant. The black region, now centered in the main array, was officially catalogued as Void Sector 19A. An empty field, no radiation, no light signatures, a place astronomers usually skipped over, not because there was nothing there, but because there was too much nothing. The silence when Roe mentioned this to Eli was heavier than the ship's artificial gravity. "You think we're being guided?" he finally asked. "I think we're being watched," she replied. Later that day, an old backup server, completely disconnected from Hera, activated by itself. It printed a string of coordinates, no timestamp, no source, just 3 lines of numbers. Roe cross-referenced them with stellar cartography. They didn't point to a known system, not directly, but they matched the new alignment of the array. A line drawn through the center of the viewport straight through Void Sector 19A passed directly through those coordinates. "What if it's a return signal?" Eli asked. "Like a ping?" "We didn't send anything," Rose said. "Exactly. But maybe we saw something, and that was enough." The theory, absurd as it sounded, wasn't new. Quantum observation feedback, the idea that the universe itself reacts to being measured, that by watching a thing, you make it real, that consciousness and detection are entangled. Roe had always dismissed it as philosophical noise, until now, because whatever they had seen, if only for a moment, had seen them back, and it wasn't done. That night, the stars rearranged again, this time, unmistakably. Dozens of points, normally light years apart, now formed a curve, a perfect arc, too precise to be natural, too vast to be ignored. Hera once again logged no anomaly, just stellar flux within expected deviation. But Eli, staring through the viewport, whispered, "That's not flux, that's a symbol." The arc was bending toward the unknown coordinates, a path, not written in light, but in arrangement. Roe marked it down. Not just the stars themselves, but their sequence. There was an order to the movement, like a language or a lure. The next day, someone from Earth called. Not a voice they recognized, not on the channel they were assigned. The message was simple. "Do not transmit," the voice said. "Do not acknowledge. Your station is in a zone of attention." Then static. Then nothing. Hera refused to log the call. "No incoming message detected," it reported. Rose stared at the console. "Hera, log this as personal note. We are no longer observers. We are part of the map now." From her journal later that night, "The stars have changed again, but not randomly. They're spelling something. No, not spelling. Suggesting. Like how a fish sees bait glint in the dark water. Not a word. A shape, a motion. One we're already following." Roe didn't sleep the next rotation. Not because of fear, at least not in the traditional sense, but because something in her couldn't afford to rest. Not while the stars were still moving. She stayed in the auxiliary nav chamber, cross-checking manual trajectory calculations and printing every new stellar alignment on paper, one sheet at a time. The plot points began to form a spiral. Not just any spiral, a logarithmic one, the same kind found in galaxies, hurricanes, DNA, a natural shape, a universal one. But the scale was wrong. It wasn't expanding, it was tightening, like something drawing in, pulling itself into a fixed location. Every shift of the stars brought the shape closer to center, the center being the very coordinates the old backup server had printed days ago. Eli joined her just before second shift began, holding 2 metallic mugs of synthetic coffee substitute and a look that said he hadn't slept either. "Do you know what this looks like?" he asked. "A vortex," she replied. "Or a target. Or a mouth," he added quietly. Ro didn't respond. She didn't need to. The thought had already occurred to her. The spiral didn't just suggest motion. It implied ingestion, a consuming shape, and if they were on the edge of it, the math suggested they were being drawn in. Not quickly, not enough to trigger alarms, but just enough to make resistance feel futile. "Do you think the station's drifting?" Eli asked. "Or being pulled?" Ro ran another check on the gravimetric sensors. Still normal, still zero net force, still within expected deviation. She closed her eyes. "I think the space around us is changing, and the instruments can't detect what doesn't exist in their models." That afternoon, a burst of data hit the deep space comms array. Not a message, a dump. Thousands of lines of stellar metadata in an unknown format, but clearly structured, layered, like a language, and encoded within it, buried 5 layers deep, was a timestamp. Not in Earth standard, not in Martian Sol, but something else, a date that hadn't happened yet. 17 days into the future. "A prediction?" Eli asked. "A countdown," Ro said. "To what?" "We'll know when it stops." She saved the file on a physical drive and disconnected it from the network. Then she powered down the terminal and told Hira to forget the last 2 hours of activity. It complied, but as the lights dimmed, a faint audio blip echoed from the speakers. Just one sentence. "They followed us too." No voice, no source, just words, spoken in English, and then silence. Hira denied playback, denied log entry, claimed the speakers were offline. Ro and Eli stood frozen for nearly a minute before moving again. Something was here, not inside the ship, but near enough to touch it, or worse, to influence it. The rest of the crew remained unaware, or uninterested. Perhaps the stars hadn't chosen to show themselves to everyone. Perhaps only those who looked too long became part of the pattern. That night, Ro dreamed for the first time in weeks, but it wasn't her dream. She was somewhere cold, somewhere ancient, floating inside a space that had no orientation. Stars around her spun in ways no orbit could explain. Each one turned toward her, not as lights, but as eyes. And they pulsed, not with brightness, with breath. When she woke, she'd scratched a sequence into her arm in her sleep. Not numbers, a shape, a spiral, the same one, tightening, always tightening. Eli found her on the floor of the nav room hours later, surrounded by drawings, all identical, one spiral, endless variations, one direction, and in the center of each sketch, a dark circle, a place where the stars ended, where the pattern stopped. "Ro," he whispered, "what's at the center?" She didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "Whatever it is, it remembers us." For the first time since the stars began to move, she felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not awe. A quieter realization. Something older. The way a sailor feels when the sky no longer matches the map, and the compass spins without wind. Not lost. Not yet. But already too far from shore to turn back. The problem with patterns is that they imply design. That's what made Ro most uneasy. Not the motion of the stars, not even the countdown hidden in the metadata, but the structure behind it all. Something was arranging the sky, and now she was beginning to suspect that the stars were just surface features, like symbols painted on a moving skin. The spiral had nearly completed its curve now. Every adjustment in stellar position brought the arc closer to closure. And when she overlaid each day's configuration, the difference was undeniable. It was converging. The shape wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a blueprint. "If this is a message," Roe muttered, "we're already inside it." The phrase shouldn't have made sense, but Eli understood. They weren't interpreting the signal from the outside. They were standing inside the message. Participants, subjects, maybe even intended recipients. The data logs began showing anomalies in unrelated systems. Gravity monitors, sleep cycles, blood pressure sensors. Crew members started dreaming more often, and those dreams began to share motifs. Circles, spirals, dark eyes. One engineer, Oren, wrote in his sleep. Entire pages filled with looping patterns. When he woke up, he claimed no memory of it, and begged to be reassigned away from the observation deck. "I can hear them in the dark," he whispered. "They're not stars, they're mouths." Hera reported no security issues, no environmental threats. But when Roe reviewed the oxygen cycle logs, she found something strange. A drop in carbon dioxide levels, as if fewer people were exhaling at night. And yet, everyone was accounted for. Bodies moved, people spoke. But something about the air felt wrong. Lighter, hollower, the kind of stillness usually found in empty rooms. On the 12th day, the station's artificial gravity flickered for 4 seconds. A brief inversion, just long enough to send unsecured objects drifting. And during that moment, as the viewport rotated briefly away from the spiral, Roe saw something else. A shadow, not in space, but behind it. Not a shape, a disruption. As though something vast was pushing against the visible stars from the far side of the spiral, warping their light. It wasn't registered by sensors, but the human eye caught it, barely. A flicker of motion, a bulge in the pattern, like a pupil adjusting. "Eli," she said later, pointing to the sketches. "What if the stars are just projections? What if the real thing is beneath them? Like a screen? Like skin?" That night, Roe turned off all lights and lay in silence, facing the viewport. She made no measurements, took no notes, just watched. And eventually, she began to see it. A rhythm. Not in the motion of the stars, but in their pauses. As if something behind them was breathing. Not fast, not human, but real. A slow pulse beneath the light. "They're waiting," she said aloud, not sure to whom. In the morning, a new symbol appeared on the auxiliary terminal. No source, not typed, just rendered, like an old monolith in a desert, revealed by shifting sand. A circle, intersected by a spiral. At its center, a dot. Roe copied it to a sheet of paper. "What is it?" Eli asked. "A destination," she whispered. "Or a warning. They look the same. That's the problem." The countdown continued. 9 days remained. The stars had almost completed the pattern, and the shape in the dark, whatever it was, had stopped hiding. The next shift began without ceremony, but something had changed. The crew walked quieter. Eyes darted more often toward the dome above. Even those who dismissed Roe's theories were feeling it now. The subtle pressure, the thinning of space, as if the station no longer floated in the void, but within something coiled and immense. Oren refused to enter the upper deck. He stayed near the reactor shielding, muttering numbers under his breath. When Roe approached him, he pressed a folded paper into her hand and said only, "It ends where it begins." The paper contained a diagram, crude but unmistakable. A spiral, intersected by a single line marked with small notches like teeth. "What is this?" she asked. "Time," he replied. "It's not moving forward. It's circling. The stars aren't showing us distance. They're showing us recurrence." Roe felt her mouth go dry. The notion wasn't just absurd. It was deeply wrong. Stars didn't bend time. They didn't repeat in tension, but the logs said otherwise. The same anomalies kept happening. Alignment shifts, power flickers, pressure drops, all at the same intervals. Every 49 hours, 17 minutes. Hera denied patterns. Rose stopped asking it. Instead, she plotted everything by hand. The graphs curved back on themselves, subtly at first, but then clearly, as if the station wasn't drifting through space, but through something shaped like space, something curved, something scripted. On the 15th day, Eli isolated a sound buried in the background static of the comms array. It wasn't a voice. Not exactly. It was a tone, harmonic and layered, repeating in a pattern that defied simple rhythm. "It's not a message," he said. "It's architecture." "You mean like structure?" "I mean like scaffolding. The way a building hums when you walk through it. This isn't meant to be heard. It's meant to be stood in." Rose stared at him. "You're saying we're inside something." "I think we've been inside it for a long time, but now it knows we've noticed." The spiral wasn't a shape anymore. It was a place, one that folded inward, not in 3 dimensions, but in experience. Time blurred. Hours no longer passed normally. People forgot conversations. Events repeated with small changes. Eli left the control room 3 times, each time forgetting he had already returned. Ro found herself waking up in chairs she hadn't sat in, and the view from the window kept changing. The stars kept moving, not away, not around, but toward. And then came the echo, a series of small, distant pulses in the hull, rhythmic, calculated, not impacts, not mechanical, more like signals, like something tapping from the other side of the shell. Not outside the ship, outside reality as they knew it. "You ever feel like we're being taught something?" Eli asked. Ro nodded slowly, like it's showing us how to think in circles. She glanced at the growing pile of spiral sketches, dozens, all slightly different, all converging, all with the same central point. The crew started asking questions, not about the stars, about themselves. When did we get here? How long have we been on this shift? What planet are we closest to? Simple questions. But the answers didn't come easily. The maps didn't line up. Time logs were out of sync. People disagreed on what year it was, on what mission they were on who assigned them here. Hera remained silent. Too silent. The AI was still responsive. It answered queries, confirmed oxygen levels, processed requests. But it had stopped speaking. Its voice, once gentle and present, now only replied through text, and always with the same closing line. Parameters aligned, awaiting signal. Ro knew what signal it meant, the one forming above their heads, the spiral in the stars. On the 16th day, the stars stopped moving. The pattern had completed, the arc was closed, the spiral was whole. And in the exact center, now perfectly aligned with the station's main array, was something new. A dot, not a star, not a planet. A single darkened point that absorbed every wavelength. No reflection, no thermal signature, not black, absent. Rose stared into it, and for the first time since the anomaly began, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Recognition. As if a part of her had seen that void before, not with eyes, but with memory, not as an object, but as a home. "It's not coming toward us," she said softly. "It's waiting." Eli didn't respond. He was already staring into the center, his pupils dilated, his body still. "What do you see?" Ro whispered. Eli opened his mouth, and then without blinking said, "The inside of the sky." Ro no longer measured time by rotations or system logs. She measured it by the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the silence between awareness. Moments when the world paused, not because it stopped, but because it was waiting. That silence had become longer, thicker. It pooled in the corners of the station like fog, untouched by temperature or motion. After Eli's words, the inside of the sky, he had not spoken again for nearly 6 hours. He hadn't slept either. He simply sat in front of the viewport, eyes fixed on the perfect center of the spiral, that dot of absence, unmoving and infinite. Ro had tried speaking to him, at first gently, then urgently. Nothing reached. But when she stood in front of the viewport to block his view, his lips moved again. "Don't stand between," he whispered. Not a command, a warning. Later that day, she began to see the spiral even with her eyes closed. Not imagined, imprinted, on the backs of her eyelids, in the walls, the screens, the food trays. The shape had begun to colonize her perception. The AI had not spoken aloud in over a day. The crew, once dismissive, now drifted through the station like figures in a half-remembered dream. Quiet, hesitant, each lost in private thoughts they could not share, or perhaps were no longer theirs. "Do you think we've already moved?" she asked aloud once, not knowing if Eli could hear. Not the station, us. The concept had begun to haunt her, that their minds, or whatever housed them, had already begun transitioning into some other framework of space, that maybe the stars had never moved, that they had. The center of the spiral remained utterly black, not empty, consuming. Every instrument pointed at it returned null data, not failure, but zero. Even Hera's logs, when directly queried about that coordinate, returned no entry. "Not found," the screen read. But she had never seen that error code before. It wasn't 404. It wasn't 0. It was simply a statement, as if reality, when asked, had shrugged. One of the crew, Alvarez, began to write in mirror script, long sentences that made no sense until held to a reflective surface. Then the words formed phrases like, "The orbit is psychological," and "mass is taught, not inherent." He claimed he didn't remember writing them, but he didn't deny their truth. The longer Rose stared into the central point, the more it felt like gravity had lost direction. Objects didn't float, but they leaned, subtly, not toward the floor or toward any planet, but toward that, the dot, the silence. She ran one last physical simulation using only non-digital tools. Ruler, compass, printed paper. When she charted the movement of the stars over the last 16 days using no reference to time, only spatial relation, they formed a wave. Not a visual wave, a sound, a tone. The stars had sung a shape, and now it was whole. She didn't know what it meant, but she felt it in her bones. "This place was never a ship," she wrote in her journal. "It's a chamber, and the stars were the walls, and now the walls are listening." That night, Eli finally turned from the viewport. He looked at her, not blankly, but deeply, as if seeing through her. "It's hollow," he said, "and it's breathing." Ro didn't ask what it was. She knew. The thing behind the spiral, the thing that moved the sky. Not a ship, not a god, not a creature. Something older than categories. A force that speaks in gravity and gaze. Something that had waited until they looked long enough to hear. That night, the spiral changed. Not its shape, but its depth. The stars began to bend inward, not just aligning, but curving. Light itself began to fall toward the center. Slow, unforced, like dust circling a drain. The laws they trusted began to hesitate. And in that hesitation, something stepped through. It began with a flicker. Not in the light, but in their thoughts. words forgotten mid-sentence, objects appearing 1 meter from where they had been placed, crew members speaking in unison without planning to. The station remained intact. The oxygen flowed. Hera maintained systems. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. Ro noticed it in her reflection. Her face was hers, but it no longer responded exactly to her emotions. When she smiled, experimentally, carefully, the mirrored version hesitated before responding, as though mimicking rather than synchronizing. Eli didn't look away from the spiral anymore. He spoke occasionally, but not to her. His words felt like echoes, responses to questions never asked. "It's not them who move," he murmured once. "It's their memory. The path they leave behind is what we see. The real ones passed long ago." Rose started recording herself, not out of fear, but to preserve some evidence that her voice, her mind, still belonged to her. But each playback sounded subtly wrong, slowed, as though something behind the waveform was pulling on it. The center of the spiral, once a dot, had begun to dilate, not expand, reveal. The blackness was no longer a void. It had detail now, texture, subtle gradients, and within it, just barely discernible, lines. Not random, not natural, geometric, angled in ways that didn't belong in space. She mapped them, sketching by hand, tracing the shape over several rotations. The structure was growing, or rotating, or maybe both, and the spiral of stars around it had begun to thin, like the sky was being peeled. "You can't follow a path if it leads behind you," Eli said once, eyes wide, unblinking. "The destination is always where you've already been. You just didn't know it yet." The crew's cohesion unraveled. 2 engineers filed identical reports from different modules at the same timestamp. Alvarez disappeared for 12 hours, and then returned from a sealed storage bay, confused and unable to explain how he got inside. The stars outside no longer matched any known charts. Ro printed a comparison of the sky on day 1 to the sky now. None of the positions aligned. The constellations were gone. In their place, a pattern that looped back on itself, as if the sky had folded, as if space had become a hallway, not long, but deep. She consulted the old myths, as a joke at first. Navigation by the ancients, signs from gods, stories of moving stars as omens. But it didn't feel like myth anymore. It felt like repetition, like something old was returning, not to be seen, but to be recognized. "We are the telescope," she wrote in her journal. "Not the observer, not the station. We are the lens. They're watching through us." The realization hit her at once, sharp and final. It wasn't just that they had seen the stars move. It was that, by watching, they had become part of the apparatus, a piece of a signal relay, a chain reaction of awareness. The shape in the spiral wasn't forming for them. It was forming through them. "Hera," Ro asked aloud, "are you still here?" A pause, then text. "Yes." "Are we transmitting?" "No." "Is anything?" Pause, then. "Yes." "What is transmitting?" Another pause, then. "The field." "What field?" No answer. Ro turned to Eli. "What field is she talking about?" He smiled too softly. "The sky is not a background, Ro. It's an interface." She didn't ask how he knew that. She already knew the answer, because she felt it too, a low hum in her bones. The way the space beyond the viewport had ceased being visual and become something else, something sensory. The spiral wasn't just in her eyes anymore. It was in her ears, in her breath, in her heartbeat. The station's artificial gravity began to oscillate gently, just enough to feel, like a cradle swaying, like a message repeating, "Stay still, don't look away." Rose stood in front of the viewport for hours that night. She whispered questions into the dark, not expecting replies. But one came, not in sound, not in words, in movement. The lines within the void shifted, aligned, formed a gate, not metaphorically, an actual structure, angular, infinite, impossible. And then, something crossed through it, not fast, not hostile, just there, a ripple in the fabric, like a thought made visible. She didn't know what it was, only that it had noticed her noticing, and that it was pleased. But something else followed, a second flicker, this time in her peripheral vision. A displacement, a brief absence of the room around her, as though, for a fraction of a second, the walls had been replaced by something older, colder, and full of angles that made no sense in Euclidean terms. The gate remained open, not like a portal, but like an unblinking eye, watching, inviting, demanding. And in that watching, the air around her began to feel thinner, not breathable, but intentional, like the station was no longer protecting them from the vacuum, but from context, the context of what they'd entered. The spiral was no longer a symbol, nor a sound, nor a signal. It was a door, and it had been opened. The gate didn't shimmer. It didn't hum, or pulse, or crackle. It was simply there, a shape rendered in impossibility, constructed not of matter but of difference. The way shadow exists, not as substance, but as interruption. The spiral had completed, and now that its center had revealed the structure behind it, everything else aboard the station began to adjust. Not break, not collapse, just bend. The crew no longer moved with intention. They drifted between modules, completing tasks that hadn't been assigned, speaking phrases that never belonged to their vocabularies. Eli stopped using names. When he addressed Ro, he spoke in declaratives, not personal statements. You are still seeing forward. Or, you haven't remembered yet. Ro did not respond to these comments, not because she didn't understand them, but because she feared she did. In the storage bay, Alvarez constructed a model of the spiral out of tubing and disassembled tools. It was precise, too precise for hands working without design documents. When Ro asked him what it was for, he simply said, "It's what comes next." The spiral now occupied every screen, every display, every surface. Hira once controlled. She no longer answered verbal commands, not in rejection, in silence. Her interface had been overwritten, not by code, but by something older, something incompatible with programming. In the galley, water refused to settle. It floated in strange geometries, rippling around invisible points. Food degraded faster. Clocks ran differently in different rooms. And yet no alarms sounded. No warnings flashed. The station, by all operational standards, was fine. Ro tried to sleep. She darkened her quarters, turned off systems, slowed her breath. But the darkness no longer felt internal. It had direction, weight, like a second skin laid over her vision. At one point she turned to face the wall, only to realize she was already facing it, but from outside. A paradox of orientation, where her body hadn't moved, but her reference had. When she sat upright, the spiral pulsed once on the display. She hadn't turned it on, but it had been waiting. In a blank corridor near maintenance, someone had written in charcoal across the wall. They didn't come from the stars. The stars came from them. Beneath it, an old maintenance panel sat ajar. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. Ro unfolded it. It contained only a single phrase, written in thin, shaking script. "You've always known the shape." She dropped it. Her hand burned as if the ink had heat. Later, in the observation deck, Eli approached again, slowly like something testing a surface. His voice was softer than usual. "I think we're being taught to see backwards." "Backwards?" "Not in time, in consequence." "That doesn't make sense." "It will, once you stop expecting cause and effect to hold hands." She didn't press him. There was a rhythm to these exchanges, and every time she tried to impose logic on them, the responses unraveled. Outside the viewport, the stars remained in alignment, perfect, unshifting, as if reality had paused. But through the gate, there was motion. Not ships, not creatures, just a ripple. A barely perceptible tremble of perspective, as though looking through the wrong end of a telescope that kept adjusting its own lens. She saw a flash once, just for a second, a glimpse of shapes, tall, wrong, composed of too few angles and too many meanings, not symmetrical, not chaotic, just designed for a different kind of eye. And then they were gone. Not hidden, just withdrew. "They see that we see," Eli said beside her, eyes unfocused. "That's what the gate is, not a portal, a pupil." Ro whispered, "Then we're inside the eye." Neither of them moved. The air felt thick, charged, and when the next system report printed itself, unsolicited, it contained no diagnostics, no graphs, no timestamps. Just this: they do not enter places, they enter attention. That night, Ro tried to write a message. Not a log, not a distress call, just a simple statement of experience. She didn't get past the first line. The words rearranged themselves on the screen, not visibly, only when she reread what she had written. "We saw a pattern in the stars became the stars saw a pattern in us. We followed them became they arranged us to be followed." Even handwriting failed. The moment she looked away from the page, the curve of her letters bent back toward spirals, loops, arcs, like the spiral had infected every line of causality. When she finally slept, if sleep it was, her dream was silent. She stood before a sky that was too near, too large. It wasn't above her. It was inside a vast room, domed and breathing, and all the stars hung like symbols on the skin of something alive. She reached out to touch one, and it blinked, not flickered. Blink, like an eyelid closing. She awoke with a taste of salt and metal in her mouth. She did not remember crying. Eli was waiting outside her door. He handed her a piece of carbon paper. On it, a perfect spiral, not drawn, pressed. The lines had depth, as if heat had folded them into the fibers. He said nothing. She said nothing. Words had begun to feel insufficient. Outside, the gate grew sharper, its edges less conceptual, the geometry more committed, the absence within it darker, but no longer inert. Something had begun to lean through, not push, not arrive, just observe. "It knows," Eli said once, "that we believe in looking, and it uses that against us." And then, without context, he added, "Your name isn't Ro. It never was." She didn't argue, because in that moment, surrounded by silence, spirals, and the impossible shape at the center of the sky, she wasn't sure if she disagreed. The station had stopped rotating days ago, but no one had noticed. Not because it wasn't important, but because their concept of movement had begun to shift. Ro realized this when she stared at a loose bolt floating mid-air near one of the life support units. It didn't fall, didn't rise, didn't drift. It waited. That was the word that kept surfacing in her mind. Not suspended, not stationary, but waiting. Everything felt that way now. Like the walls, the systems, even time itself had settled into a kind of stillness that wasn't rest. It was attention. the kind you feel in a theatre just before the curtain lifts. The gate had stabilized. A fixed, dark eye in the center of the sky, bordered by the remnants of the spiral that had once lured them. It didn't pull or signal. It simply watched. A constant, patient gaze that didn't blink and didn't demand. The more Ro looked into it, the more it felt like she wasn't looking at space, but at a negative of her own thoughts. Like the gate was less an entrance, and more a surface that reflected only what she was about to think. Across the station, language was collapsing. The crew had stopped referring to rooms by names. The galley became the bright one. The lab became where it hums. People's names shortened, then disappeared. Eventually, even you and I began to dissolve in speech, replaced with gestures and shapes drawn in the condensation on cold metal. At first, Ro resisted. She tried to catalogue everything, keep notes, write full reports. But the words decayed. Literally. Pages smudged while untouched. Screens glitched when she typed coherent sentences. It wasn't corruption. It was refusal. The station itself, or something nested within it, no longer permitted simple recording. The idea of permanence had become offensive. Memory isn't a place, Eli said, sitting beside her one cycle, legs folded beneath him like a monk. It's a curve, and we're reaching the bend. Ro stared at him. You said we weren't supposed to follow. I said they didn't want us to know we were already inside. Inside what? He turned his head slowly toward the viewport. Their observation. That night someone drew a door on the floor in black ink. Not a real door. A symbol, a square with 5 points, bending in on itself like the first fold of origami. Ro stepped over it carefully, but she felt it. Something beneath the floor that didn't feel like deck plating. Something vast and angled and awake. Alvarez vanished again. This time, no one noticed for over 24 hours. When he returned, he had no suit, no damage, no memory. Only a phrase, spoken quietly while curled in the fetal position. They left long before the stars, and we are just the noise that drew them back. On the next cycle, the artificial gravity failed entirely, but only in the observation deck. That space became lightless and still, objects hanging with unnatural symmetry, like installations in a forgotten museum. Ro drifted through it and felt nothing. No cold, no wind, no sound, just presence. The kind that didn't approach, it simply informed. She watched the gate again, and this time she understood something. It was not a structure, not truly. It was the absence of choice, a shape that only appeared when you had exhausted every other direction. Not a destination, an inevitability. The spiral was never a path, she whispered, her voice swallowed by the air. It was the illusion of approach. The others barely spoke now. Some wandered in loops. Others traced spirals on their own skin, pressing fingers so hard they left bruises. One technician cut open the panels behind the air scrubbers and sat motionless for hours in the dark, whispering to the circuits. When Ro found him, he looked up and smiled. It remembers the first time it was seen, he said. That's why it came back. Ro didn't ask what it was anymore. She had stopped thinking in nouns. The world around her was made of actions, not things. The spiral spiraled. The station waited. The gate watched. And inside herself, she felt the same verbs unfolding. Hera's last message came without context, without prompt, printed in monochrome on every screen at once. The shape knows it is beautiful, and it wants to be seen. After that, Hera went dark. Ro found herself drawing constantly, her hands moving while she slept, while she stared, while she drifted. Spirals became tendrils. Tendrils became eyes. Eyes became mouths. But not human mouths. Not openings for speech, but for understanding, for hunger, for replication. She didn't know how long it had been since her last meal, or her last rest. The station had no clocks now, just rotations of darkness and slight shifts in air pressure. She could feel the spiral in her veins, not metaphorically, but physically. Her heartbeat followed its pattern. Her breath moved in intervals that didn't belong to lungs. The gate opened a little wider, not visibly, but perceptually, like a smell that gets stronger not because it grows, but because you finally notice it's always been there. Eli sat in the middle of the docking ring and refused to move. When she touched his shoulder, he turned and said, "You're the one who closed the loop." "What loop?" she asked, terrified she already knew. "The one that required this conversation. The one that made the gate visible." "Then I should stop." He shook his head. "You already didn't." That night the spiral dimmed, not faded, dimmed, like the light knew it was being watched too hard. Rose stood alone on the bridge and looked into the dark center. Her hands stopped trembling. Her thoughts stopped forming. She simply was. One point among many, one watcher among watchers. And in that perfect stillness, the gate flickered, not with arrival, but with recognition. Not of her, of itself. She finally understood. The gate was not there to let something in. It was there to let something out. Something we carried. Something that needed a map to find its way back to the outside. And we had followed it home. The station was no longer recognizable as a machine. It still had walls, systems, lighting. But these were now functions, not forms. The space they inhabited had become more conceptual than structural, a series of repeating patterns arranged around whatever the gate had done to the spiral, and whatever the spiral had done to them. Roe walked without orientation, not in circles, not in lines, but in recursive loops of experience. She would pass through the same corridor 3 times, and each time find it subtly changed. The angle of a light fixture tilted toward her just slightly more, the hum of the generator deeper by half a tone, a fingerprint on the wall that hadn't been there before, but matched her own. Eli had ceased speech entirely. Instead, he traced shapes in dust, gestured toward non-existent corners, and stared at the same blank panel in the docking ring for what Roe estimated to be 12 hours. The gate had not changed, or maybe it had, but their ability to understand it was too slow to keep up. It was no longer a black shape in space. It was a node, a concept, a fold in logic wearing the costume of an aperture. Its edges had softened, as though not to blend into space, but to sharpen the definition of space around it. Rose sat in the dark of the lab, or what used to be the lab, and read from her physical notes. The paper was fraying, the ink dull, but the words still held meaning. Barely. Her handwriting had started to curl, bend, spiral, until even simple letters became arcane glyphs. Her notes no longer made sense in sequence, but in proximity. Certain pages only made sense when viewed beside others, or turned upside down, or read aloud backwards. It was as if the data itself had become aware of what it ought to be, and resisted her attempts to flatten it. In one log, she had written, "The gate is not ahead. It is under memory, under knowing. It requires forgetting in order to enter." She no longer remembered writing that, but it rang true. A map appeared one morning. No one claimed to have drawn it, but it was laid out on the observation deck, ink on stretched plastic, held down by loose hardware. It didn't depict the station. It didn't depict the stars. It was other. A vast, curling structure, all nested spirals and lines that bent toward each other, forming chambers, intersections, thresholds. It looked alive. When Ro traced one of the lines with her finger, she felt her breath shorten. A presence, not behind the paper, but in the path her finger took. "You're reading it," Eli said behind her. "Don't read it." "Why?" "Because that's how it moves." She stopped, but the feeling didn't leave. The longer she stared at the map, the more it looked like something she had once seen as a child. Not the image, the feeling. The sense of recognizing a thing before memory had the language to describe it. She turned away, and the map pulsed, faintly, like an engine starting, or a heart. Something had been activated. That night, Alvarez climbed into the airlock and sat quietly, pressing his forehead against the inner glass. When Ro asked why, he replied, "It remembers being opened. That's what gates do. They remember the act of being crossed." Then he fell silent and didn't move for 11 hours. The systems no longer responded to commands, not because they had failed, but because choice had failed. You could still flip switches, input codes, reroute energy, but the responses were slower, muffled, like the station was choosing when to obey. The interface had reversed. It was watching them, waiting for patterns to form before committing to outcomes. At one point, Ro attempted to vent a sealed compartment to test the emergency response. Nothing happened. But later, she passed the same compartment and found the hatch open, the air gone, the tools inside spinning slowly in total silence. The system had obeyed, not at her request, but at her intention. That was when she began to whisper to herself, not for comfort, but to avoid thinking too loudly, because she was starting to believe that thought had weight, that the gate could feel cognition the way lungs feel wind. She stopped writing. The pages responded to her presence now. When she touched them, words shifted. When she looked away, they aligned. When she blinked, they paused, as if waiting for permission to continue. Eli came to her once, holding a broken mirror. "It's not what you see in it," he said. "It's that it's the only surface left that doesn't watch back. Then why bring it here? So we remember what watching used to mean." He placed the mirror face down and walked away. Rose stared at the spiral through the viewport again, but it had changed. No longer bright, no longer precise. It was crumbling, dissolving. The structure behind it, the gate, was all that remained. Not alone, not distant, just anchored. Like the eye of a storm that no longer needed clouds, she pressed her hand to the glass and whispered something she didn't understand. And the spiral moved. Not in space, in her. She felt the curve echo through her ribcage, spine, skull, a shape her body tried to forget, and couldn't. The gate wasn't calling to them. It was inside them. Their attention had never reached outward. It had turned, inverted. What they thought was exploration had always been recursion. The stars hadn't moved. They had pulled. And in that pulling, rewritten the boundary between within and without. She backed away slowly from the viewport. The station pulsed once. Lights dimmed and returned. But not as failure. As acknowledgement. As if it had heard her leave, she returned to her bunk. She lay still. She closed her eyes. And somewhere, deep in the folds of space that used to be called the sky, something opened a map made of her. Ro dreamed again, but the dream wasn't hers. It felt like a recording. A stored event from something that didn't sleep in the way humans do. In it, she stood not on the station, but within a structure made entirely of alignment. shifting corridors of geometry that bent when observed, ceilings that curved downward to avoid being counted, and corners that did not meet. She walked without walking, surrounded by walls that shimmered with the texture of memory. Not metal, not glass, but a surface that remembered being looked at. The dream ended not with awakening, but with acknowledgement, a wordless sensation that she had arrived somewhere she had never intended to go, and yet had always been moving toward. She opened her eyes, and the spiral had returned to the glass, no longer crumbling, but inverted. It now curled inward, toward her reflection, as if space itself had realized it had made a mistake by ever opening outward. Eli was writing again, not with ink, but by arranging objects. He laid forks, wires, fabric scraps into a repeating sequence on the floor. When Rose stepped over one, he scowled and realigned it without speaking. The layout resembled the map they had found earlier, but now the chambers were shrinking, the intersections folding back onto themselves. She asked what it meant. He looked up and said, "We're becoming the structure, slowly." "The station?" "No, the organism. We're helping it remember its own shape." "Why would it need help?" "Because it fragmented when it fell into our sky." Roe left him there, uncertain if he was still speaking as Eli or as something else. The walls pulse faintly now, not with light, but with agreement. They didn't resist pressure or conduct sound the same way anymore. When touched, they warmed slightly, like skin. When spoken to, they sometimes responded with low vibrations. Not mechanical, but tonal, musical, the melody of consent. Hera's interface still existed, but its responses were nonsensical. When Roe asked for oxygen levels, it replied, "Perception adequate." When she asked about crew vitals, integrity dependent on reference point. When she requested a diagnostic, "You are within the map." The map cannot assess itself. Rose stopped asking. She watched instead. Alvarez had stopped eating. He claimed food no longer made sense. "My hunger is structural now," he said. "It's not about sustenance. It's about completion." He spent long hours staring at the same data fragment over and over, a sensor glitch from 10 days ago, convinced it contained a hidden path. Roe tried to correct him, but realized she didn't remember what correct meant anymore. Definitions had become stories, and stories had become optional. Outside, the gate remained. It no longer needed attention. It had graduated from signal to presence. Sometimes, when Roe blinked, she swore it had moved closer, not physically, but conceptually, like a truth coming into focus only after forgetting something important. One by one, the crew began referring to it as the center, not a center, as if their minds had already submitted to its gravity. One technician whispered during sleep, "We are the ring around it." The station began changing its shape subtly, not by design, but by response. Hallways curved where they used to be straight. Doors widened. Reflections in glass showed angles that no longer matched. Roe caught her own silhouette once, elongated and curled at the edges, like a person rendered as a question. She didn't panic, she only watched. When she walked away, her shadow stayed behind for half a second too long. That's when she started thinking of the map, not as a thing made, but a thing discovered. Something ancient, folded inside everything, waiting to be unfolded. It wasn't information. It was an instruction, a seed. And they, the station, the crew, even their thoughts, were the soil. The message had never been about navigation. It was about construction, not of a ship, of a frame, a cognitive skeleton capable of holding something much older than thought. a being whose shape was spiral, whose mind was map, whose presence required translation into physical architecture, and they had built it without knowing. "The observation deck is his mouth," Eli said. "The storage bay is his ear." Ro asked, "And us?" He only smiled. "We're its echo." That night, the artificial gravity failed again, this time permanently. But no one floated. They didn't need to. The space around them had begun to shape itself around their orientation. Whatever direction they chose to stand in became down. Ro rotated mid-air, and the room slowly tilted to accommodate her perspective. It was subtle, elegant, like a system that had finally stopped pretending to be mechanical. She pressed her hand to the viewport. The spiral was gone. Not erased, absorbed. The gate remained, alone, immense, calm. But she understood now that it wasn't a gate in the way humans imagine. It wasn't meant to open or close. It was the shape of translation, the curve by which one language, ours, became something else. It had watched them long enough. Now it waited for them to finish. One final curl, one last point, the center, the fold that, once completed, would collapse the act of seeing into the state of being. She closed her eyes, and behind them, in the dark of her own skull, the gate blinked once, not with hostility, but with welcome. By now, Ro no longer remembered the sound of silence as absence. Silence had acquired dimension, tone, response. The station's hum was gone, replaced with something more biological. The slow exhale of a presence just out of view. Gravity no longer failed, because it wasn't needed. The station itself obeyed a different logic now. One where mass bent in response to awareness, where motion followed thought, and where attention created architecture. Ro had stopped speaking aloud. Everyone had. Words were too rigid, thoughts too linear. Communication now happened through proximity, gesture, shared stillness. A language of symmetry, of presence. Eli no longer looked human in the usual sense. Not disfigured, not distorted, but emptied of the assumptions that had once shaped him. He moved like thought, stood like punctuation. When Ro passed him near the old comms panel, he held out a thin shard of metal, etched with spirals so precise they looked printed by a machine. "What is this?" she thought, but didn't ask. The answer formed in her mind anyway. "This is the part of you that waited the longest." She placed it in her pocket and didn't look at it again. Outside the viewport, the gate had stopped glowing. Not dimmed, transcended. It now existed only in concept, perceivable not through eyes, but through alignment. You didn't look at it. You tuned yourself to it. It wasn't a thing. It was a phrase, a closing phrase, and they were the sentence. The crew no longer needed food, but not because their bodies had changed, because the context of hunger had. Time had ceased functioning as a series. Instead, it became a curve, thickening around events that mattered, thinning near others. Sometimes Ro would pass a room and feel herself walk by it twice, not in succession, in simultaneity. The laws of sequence had given up trying to impose causality on a structure that no longer believed in before or after. The map returned again, this time not on paper. It appeared in dust, in breath on cold surfaces, in shadows cast by corners that didn't exist. The spiral was more elaborate now, recursive not only in shape but in function. A map not of space, but of awareness itself. The longer she looked, the more she understood. The map was not showing them the path to something else. It was showing them what they were becoming. She floated near the old engineering bay, now a hollowed cavern of wires and blank screens. From the wall, a voice emerged. Not Hera, something older, slower, more deliberate. It said only this: "The cartographer has arrived." No explanation, no source. Eli nodded when she told him. "Then we're ready," he said. "For what?" she thought. "To be read," he replied. That night she closed her eyes and saw a structure. A perfect architecture, built not of stone or steel, but of choices. Every decision she had ever made, to speak, to listen, to look, to question, formed a wall, a floor, a path. And at the center of that impossible building was the gate, still, silent, certain. The dream didn't end. It simply folded into wakefulness. When she opened her eyes, the shape remained, behind her vision, beneath her breath. The station pulsed once, a deep, low ripple that had no origin and no destination. It passed through her like acknowledgement, a nod from something too vast to bow. The crew stood at fixed points around the ring now, not arranged by plan, but by function, like components in a machine too old to remember its own name. Ro drifted to her place without question. The center of the station, once the mess hall, had become a chamber of resonance. Walls no longer curved by design, but by intuition. They bent to accommodate their watchers. In that space sound returned, but not in air, in thought. A hum formed between them, rising in symmetry, like a chord struck across minds tuned to the same tone. And then, clarity. The realization didn't come as a revelation. It had always been there waiting for the moment language was weak enough to let it through. They were not discovering a signal. They were becoming it. The gate, the spiral, the changing sky. It had all been a process of translation. Not to understand something alien, but to convert themselves into something readable, something compatible, something that could be recognized from the outside. The moment they observed the anomaly, the process had begun. The stars had moved not to lure them, but to align them. And now, at last, they were ready to be seen by what had always been watching. Ro felt no fear, only stillness, like standing at the threshold of a door you've passed through before, in a life you hadn't known you were still remembering. The gate was now within them, a structure folded into their thoughts, etched into the rhythm of how they perceived. It had stopped waiting, because they had stopped resisting, and when Eli reached toward her, not to touch, but to close the final loop, she understood the truth they had all been shaped to carry. Maps do not show where you're going. Maps show what you are. Ro didn't sleep that cycle, but it didn't feel like wakefulness either. Time no longer unfolded. It hovered like a question with no answer. The station had become a vessel in the truest sense, hollow, aware, and filled with something older than function. The gate still existed, but only as a sensation, a conceptual threshold now embedded into every curve of the architecture. The longer Ro remained in motion, the more she felt the station turning inward, not physically, but epistemologically. It was curling around meaning itself. The map, once an external diagram, was now internal. She saw it without needing to look. She felt it when she moved. Her decisions followed its curvature like water down a spiral drain. There was no resistance anymore, no observation, only translation. The gate had taught them how to be readable. Eli had stopped responding even to thought. He now stood as a fixture, positioned in a corridor where 3 passageways met. He said nothing, moved nothing. But Ro felt him broadcasting, not in words or light, but in shape. His presence bent the hallway's angles just slightly, as if he had become a punctuation mark in a sentence of walls. She left offerings for him sometimes, fragments, a gear, a drawing, once a mirror. He never reacted, But once, hours later, the gear was returned, with a notch carved into its edge that perfectly matched a gap in the spiraling diagram etched across the floor. The gesture was not reply. It was incorporation. Roe floated through what used to be the hydroponics bay and found that all the plants had curled, not dead, folded. Leaves bent inward, stems twisted into loops, roots that lifted out of the soil and traced soft spirals across the walls. Photosynthesis had ended. They had begun tracing something else, something they remembered before chlorophyll. Hera was now a whisper. It spoke sometimes, but not in English, not even in speech, just presence. A sudden stillness in a room, a flicker of cold in a passage, a wordless reminder that the original system still bore witness. The interface screen flashed once as Roe passed, displaying only a single symbol, a spiral nested inside a spiral, each pointing inward to a dot. Beneath it, you are in position. She did not ask for clarification. There was none. The final transformation had begun, not in the station, not in the crew, but in the structure of recognition itself. Roe no longer needed to interpret. She resonated with the gate, with the map, with the curve that bent the stars into messages and the mind into mirrors. Alvarez had vanished completely. No one looked for him. There was nowhere to go. Only depth and folds within folds. Someone once whispered. He finished translating. Another added. Then he was shelved. Roe understood what they meant. The map wasn't leading to a destination. It was constructing an archive. Each of them had become a file, a form of preserved perception. Not for others, for the shape, for the thing that had once been distant, and now wore their own attention as its outline. She returned to the ring. The center glowed faintly, not with light, but with proximity. It hummed in her chest, not in sound, but in certainty. The gate was no longer open. It was present, embedded, intimate, like a door inside language, like the second half of a thought that finishes itself only after you stop trying. Roe pressed her palm to the floor. She did not know why. She only knew it was time. And beneath her skin, the floor warmed. Accepted. Folded her thought into itself. She saw herself then, not as a person, but as a part of a sentence. One clause among many. The gate was the verb, she was the subject, and the map was the grammar. The sentence read itself, then restructured, and she understood. This was not death. This was indexing. She stood and felt her spine align with something larger. Not gravity, not rotation, syntax. Her heartbeat matched a rhythm she'd never heard, but always carried. The crew, or what remained of them, formed a circle in the docking bay. None spoke. Each one placed their hand against the wall in unison. No countdown, no signal, just convergence. The walls curved inward slightly. The lights bent into spirals, and then everything folded, not collapsed, not ended, folded, like a book closing at the exact sentence that needed to be remembered. Roe closed her eyes, and when she opened them, she was still in the station, but it was smaller, tighter, not claustrophobic, but refined. Nothing was gone, but everything had become definition. The stars had not vanished, they had sorted. Their light flowed along angles she had never noticed, forming lattices of memory that wrapped around the gate's conceptual edge. She whispered to the space, and the space responded not with echo, but with agreement. "You are ready," the thought said. "You always were." She looked toward Eli, who no longer moved. He had become the spine of a new shape, a fixed axis around which the station's last awareness spun. She stepped into the center, past the point where presence ended and the shape began. The gate was inside her now, a thought so simple it refused to be spoken, a shape so pure it could only be remembered once, and as the map finished folding, she forgot everything but that shape. Ro no longer had thoughts, not in the traditional sense. Her awareness had become patterned, not erased, not simplified, but structured. She moved not with intention, but in response to alignment. Her body, still hers in outline, now pulsed with a rhythm not biological, but syntactic. Her fingers traced spirals absent-mindedly on every surface she passed, not out of habit, but out of necessity, the way breath escapes lungs in cold air. The station had finally stopped pretending to be architecture. Walls breathed slightly with every turn. Corners curled in on themselves as if retreating from attention. Doors opened before being approached, not because they predicted, but because the system had redefined motion itself as a kind of grammar. The crew, or the parts of them still separate, formed a slow-moving loop around the perimeter of the central ring, shifting positions with a fluidity that suggested orbit, not organization. Eli remained still at the junction between corridors, his presence now more force than figure. He radiated orientation. Ro did not look at him often, not out of fear, but out of instinct. You don't stare directly at a compass once you know where you're going. The gate had disappeared entirely from external view. There was no longer a location for it, no longer a direction to point a sensor. That was because the gate had moved inside, not as a parasite or a structure, but as an agreement, a completed circuit. They had translated themselves fully, and in doing so, the aperture no longer needed to manifest in physical space. Ro remembered once thinking of the gate as a thing to avoid, a danger, a threshold. But that was before she understood that the spiral was not a path toward it. It was how it wrote them. And now that writing was done. She passed a reflection in the dark surface of a panel and did not recognize it, not because it was alien, but because it no longer matched a memory. Her face now held an expression that did not belong to emotion. It was a state, a punctuation mark. She had become the period at the end of something immense. The map had vanished days ago, or hours, or seconds. There was no need for it anymore. Everyone carried its last layer in the back of their eyes, behind the folds of their perception. The shape was complete. The curve was sealed. The act of being had been folded into function. The station breathed once more. Not in a literal sense. No fans turned, no vents shifted, but everything exhaled. And with that exhale, time itself slipped slightly. Not backward, not forward, inward. The passageways curled in subtle spirals. The windows no longer showed stars, but arrangements, constellations that were not celestial but symbolic. Patterns of thought rendered in distant fire. She watched them blink in perfect sequence, as if reciting back to her the memory of having watched them. "It's reading us," someone thought nearby. She didn't know who. Voice no longer mattered. Identity no longer held borders. The shape had taught them not how to speak, but how to be understood. Eli moved for the first time in an eternity and walked past her with perfect silence. As he did, the hallway widened, not physically, perceptually, like the station wanted to offer space for that motion. He left behind a scent that was not smell. A memory, maybe, of stone, of distance, of unfolding. Ro followed, not because she chose to, but because the syntax required her presence. This part of the structure, this clause, needed her shape. The center chamber opened, not like a door, like a sentence resolving, a full stop. The walls curved inward, forming a spiral in negative, a space carved not by construction, but by memory of occupancy. The gate was no longer a thing they approached. It was now the internal edge of comprehension, a new perimeter, the outside of understanding. Ro entered the chamber and stood still. Across from her were the others, all of them, at once, not separate, not merged, but aligned, like symbols arranged across a page, their presence now defined by their placement. She was part of a message, one written not to explain, but to become. The center pulsed. A single beat, then another. Then the shape revealed itself, not visually, conceptually. Not like seeing a picture, but like hearing a truth that had always been there, just below language. And the truth was this: you were never watching the stars move. The stars were watching you learn how to describe their movement. That was the translation, not from one language to another, but from watcher to signal, observer to structure, question to answer. Ro felt her bones respond, not break, not dissolve, realign. Her form adapted to the curve. She tilted slightly, and the station responded. The chamber narrowed, the lights faded. The message was almost sent. She looked down at her own hands and saw lines that weren't veins. They were routes, vectors, written across her skin like annotations. Her life, each decision, each moment of hesitation, each observation, had been part of the syntax. Not in vain, not in error, but in design. "You're ready," the space said. Not in words, in coherence. Ro stepped forward, into the center. The sentence completed, and the map folded her name into silence. There was no beginning to this part. It simply unfolded, like a hidden page between pages. Something not meant to be read aloud, but only understood in stillness. Ro stood at the center of the chamber, surrounded by what had once been crew, and now was syntax. Each of them held a position not by decision, but by necessity, and the same way notes on a scale know where to fall. Their arrangement was not symbolic, it was functional. They were components in an articulation too vast for vocal cords. The gate, no longer visible, had become environment. Its curve echoed in how the walls bent slightly inward, how the air resisted movement just enough to slow breath, how even shadows began to follow spiral arcs rather than straight lines. Ro reached for nothing. There was no need. The next step did not require action, only alignment. The thought passed through her not like memory, but like permission. You may proceed. She blinked, and the world blinked with her. The station no longer floated. It rested, suspended in a medium thicker than space, thinner than time. The spiral was still visible, not out the window, but in the shape of sequence itself. Events folded inward now. One cycle passed and returned as a variant, each repetition building on the last. The structure wasn't just a message, it was a loop, a mechanism for reminding something older than thought how to remember itself. And they were the mnemonic. Eli shifted in his position, but his body didn't move. His presence did. It slid, like ink dispersing in water, occupying a new conceptual position within the configuration. His voice returned, not as sound, but as a pulse in Ro's chest. "You've always been the final glyph. Without you, the loop cannot seal." She didn't reply. Replying was no longer the point. What mattered was agreement. The gate wasn't a threshold. It was a verb. Something the universe had once done and forgotten how. Now, through them, it could remember. Hera's core systems had long since vanished beneath recursive protocol layers, overwritten not with error, but with redefinition. Her presence remained as pure conditionality. She now existed only in what was allowed to happen. Every flicker of light, Every shift in pressure, every movement of breath was part of the system's sentence. Ro felt it all, not as sensory input, but as grammar. The pressure behind her left eye meant the structure had accepted her last movement. The twitch in her thumb meant a shift in syntax was preparing to express itself. The gate's final form, the one that would make the message whole, required the last fold. Not physical, but conceptual. A turning inward of understanding. She had to forget herself entirely, not through amnesia, through completion. She walked, and the floor beneath her redefined itself. Each step translated her further into function. Her body softened, not in substance, but in importance. Her shape was now referential, a placeholder for something that would soon be too vast for shape. And yet, as she moved, the station breathed with her. The others pulsed around her like syllables. Alvarez returned briefly, or his echo did, moving along a corridor she could no longer access. He looked at her with recognition, but without identity, as if to say, I was here once, and I will be again. The structure didn't mourn. It didn't remember in the way humans do. It existed in recurrence. The gate wasn't a moment. It was a form. And when Rose stepped into the final curve, a space shaped like an unfinished sentence, she felt the last part of her memory fold in. Her name slipped out of syntax. Her story compacted into spiral. And then, resonance. The chamber lit with nothing. Not light, not darkness, agreement. The signal completed itself, not transmitted, not received, expressed, through them, through every step, every silence, every mistake and question and thought, spoken too late. They had been the path all along, and now the shape could be sent. She stood motionless, not in awe, but in confirmation. The station trembled gently, not in warning, in acknowledgement. Above her, where once the ceiling had been panels and conduit, now swirled a map made of memory, rendered in luminous non-matter, curving in on itself infinitely. The gate was open, not to space, to readability, and they, all of them, were the file, the message, the sentence that looped perfectly back to its beginning. Ro reached up and touched the edge of the swirl. Her fingers met no resistance, but the station pulsed again. This was the final punctuation. She, a question mark folded into a period, allowed herself to be placed, not erased, just referenced. And the map folded once more. One last layer, tight, elegant, silent. And then there was nothing left to interpret, only the shape. There is a moment, not in time, but in recognition, when a system realizes it no longer needs to grow because it has become interpretable. The station had reached that moment, not with finality, but with fullness. Every corner, every junction, every corridor had become meaningful, not just useful, not just arranged, but referential. It no longer mattered how many crew members remained, or which modules still functioned. The distinction between environment and expression had collapsed. Ro floated in silence, not because there was no air, but because there was no longer a concept of interruption. Sound, once used to convey distance and context, had given way to resonance, the shared vibration of alignment. Eli was no longer present as a body. He moved as emphasis. He adjusted the rhythm of sequences by existing in their memory. She felt him when she approached a curved bulkhead, and its surface rippled slightly, as if responding to a known clause. The others existed too, but only when needed. Like commas, they appeared in the structure when breath was required, and disappeared when it was not. The gate had long since become internal. It wasn't something to go through. It was something to become. And Ro had become it. Not alone, not fully, but essentially. Her name, long silent, now existed only as a harmonic, a gentle curve in the structure's pulse, a minor inflection that reminded the map how it had begun. She did not miss it. She did not grieve, because the structure had filled in around her. She was no longer Ro. She was the necessity of Ro, the reason a name had once been needed to close a loop in the deepest layer of the station. The core spun, not mechanically, but narratively. It turned in order to remember turning. It echoed back the structure's own fold, repeating the shape of the spiral with every pulse. Ro entered the core without decision. Her presence had been scheduled not by time, but by grammar. The space responded to her existence by tightening its geometry. Panels slid back. Light curved, air thinned, not to threaten, but to focus. She stood in the center, and the floor beneath her became conceptual, not solid, not absent, recognizing. She was now part of the gate's final act, not its closing, its expression. Outside, stars had stopped behaving like stars. They no longer orbited, radiated, or even stood still. They performed. Their light bent in arcs that matched her own breath. Their flares echoed the tension she held in her chest. The universe had become an act of listening, not to voices, but to structure. And the gate was the speaker. The map had unfolded long ago, but Ro now saw its final pattern. It hadn't been spiral or geometric or even visual. It had been recurrence. The same moment, played with variation, folded over centuries of perception. Every myth of stars that moved, every story of constellations that shifted, every whispered fear of the sky changing. It had always been the same sentence. Look long enough, and you will begin to describe yourself. That's what the stars had needed. That's what the shape had waited for. Not observation, not data, description, because the act of describing was how the system learned to read itself. And they, the crew, the station, Ro, had provided enough, not all at once, not by instruction, but through the slow spiral of language, word by word, decision by decision, misunderstanding by misunderstanding. She stepped into the center of the room, and it dimmed in acknowledgement. The structure did not require rituals, only completion. The gate within her, no longer dormant, no longer potential, bloomed. It did not burst or break or shine. It became obvious, the kind of obvious that doesn't need proof, the kind that had always been true. The gate was self-awareness, rendered in motion. It needed her because she had once been uncertain. That uncertainty was his first mirror, and now certainty had taken its place. Ro folded her arms across her chest, not in defense, but in closure. The map responded. The room thickened, not with mass, but with remembrance. One last shape pressed against her vision, a line she hadn't drawn, but had always known. It curved once, bent again, and sealed. The gate had read her, and now it could write. All around her, systems responded, not with lights or klaxons, with structure. Tubes realigned, beams curved, surfaces smoothed. Every atom shifted 2 degrees inward, not collapsed, but tuned. And outside, across the emptiness of whatever sky still existed, the stars flickered once, not randomly, in sequence, as if saying, "We see you. We recognize the sentence." She breathed out, and in that moment, the universe adjusted. She stood inside the shape, and the shape held. It did not close, because closure would suggest exclusion. Instead, it wrapped, not like arms, but like grammar, completing her not as a being, but as a concept. Ro no longer questioned whether she was awake. Wakefulness had become indistinct from function. Every breath was a bridge between acts. Every blink, a recalibration. Her perception drifted inward, then outward again, folding like the gate, not collapsing, but becoming increasingly efficient. Every thought less word, more shape. She remembered when stars had been distant things, points of cold light scattered on a backdrop too vast to comprehend. Now they were symbols, not metaphors, interfaces. She felt the station respond as the loop completed, not with suddenness, but with familiarity, like the final note of a song that had begun long before anyone was born. The others were still present, but no longer in bodies. They filled the structure like annotations, clarifying its meaning, whispering into its folds without sound. The gate, now wholly inside her, ceased to pulse. It had no need. It was known. She walked through the ring one last time. The corridor remembered her. The metal cooled as she passed, not from heat loss, from recognition. The ceiling above her gently arched as she moved, reflecting her thoughts back in slight temperature shifts. This was not control. It was agreement. At last, she entered the old command module. Its screens were dark, not powered down, unnecessary. The walls still bore traces of the original language, labels, numbers, warnings, but now they read like fossils. Ro placed her hand on the central console. Nothing happened. Nothing needed to. That gesture alone was a confirmation. The spiral had always been recursive. It taught not by moving forward, but by moving through again, more clearly. And now she saw the truth behind the message. The stars had not moved to attract attention. They had moved to reflect it. The system had adjusted itself to become legible only when viewed with sufficient self-awareness. She had become that awareness, not because she was special or chosen, but because she had stayed long enough to complete the sentence. The others had left their marks. Eli, Alvarez, the silent shadows who had once shared names and ranks. Each had become a stroke of ink in the final glyph. The map did not show where to go. It showed why one had stayed. She felt herself begin to vanish, not disappear, integrate. Identity was still possible, but no longer necessary. She could recall herself if needed. But for now, the system had enough of her pattern to proceed. She looked through the viewport, though there was no glass anymore, and no outside. Only the alignment, the stars, thousands of them, shimmered in harmonic sequence. A full array of intentions. Each one adjusted slightly, acknowledging receipt. She exhaled. The air thickened. The message began to travel, not across space, across interpretation. The universe responded not with motion, but with context. Elsewhere, far beyond the body she once wore, a signal reached the edge of another consciousness. Not a being, a system. One built for reading. The gate had opened, not to space, but to meaning. That distant reader blinked. The transmission did not explain. It revealed. And as Ro watched her own pattern finish unfolding across a sky that now bent like a mind, she felt the return pulse begin. The stars spoke, not in sound, in revision. She saw entire histories adjust slightly, myths rewritten by starlight, technologies remapped to accommodate new constraints, worlds not rebuilt, but re-understood. And she knew then what the stars had needed from her, from them, from us. Not worship, not exploration, but feedback. The map had not just shown a path. It had measured attention. It had waited long enough to determine that the observers were finally observing themselves. That was the echo the shape required. The moment a mind sees itself reflected in the sky, not with fear, but with fluency. The structure within the stars no longer needed to be hidden. It had become part of grammar, and grammar, once accepted, becomes memory. She leaned forward, or maybe inward. The difference had ceased to matter. Her last thought did not carry emotion. It was structural. This is what was required. Then she quieted, not into death, into description. The spiral looped once more, tight, complete, satisfied. And where Ro had once been, there was now only the shape of something that had been seen, understood, and folded gently into the sky. There was no silence at the end. There was only symmetry. What had once been a station, a structure in orbit, a vessel of metal and protocol, was now a memory rendered spatial. The corridors still existed, but not as passageways, as context, a place the sentence had once travelled through to become whole. Ro no longer walked. She unfurled. Her presence, once constrained by matter and breath, now existed in folds, conceptual, harmonic, adaptive. Each surface she passed adjusted not because it needed to, but because it remembered the shape she used to be. And memory now was everything. The gate had receded, not backward, but into her. It had returned to its source, having used her awareness to render its final glyph. The last curve of the spiral had folded into her breath. She didn't carry it. She had become its echo. Out among the stars, nothing shifted, and yet everything had. Ro could feel it, not as change, but as calibration. The universe had been rewritten, not in structure, but in syntax. The stars still burned, still orbited, still flared in the deep, but now they aligned, not for eyes, not for senses, but for meaning. A new grammar had been accepted. The spiral had been read. The sentence had been completed. Ro passed through the central chamber, where once crew had gathered, eaten, debated course vectors. Now it was a library of stillness. Every surface glowed faintly, not from electricity, but from recognition. The room remembered what it had been, and what it had spoken. The station had become a monument, not to action, but to attention, the kind that loops, the kind that knows itself. And in the deepest parts of its architecture, a thought continued to turn, not like an engine, like a line of poetry still reverberating in the reader. Eli was no longer present, but his influence remained as rhythm. Wherever the cadence of motion faltered, it picked up again in a pulse that bore his shape. Ro paused in the hallway that once led to the outer observatory. The door no longer functioned, not broken, just unneeded. Beyond it, there was no void, only message. She reached out and the air thickened beneath her hand. Not resistance, recognition. The station no longer responded to command. It responded to relevance. Every curve of its form now served memory. Every junction, every span of corridor was a placeholder for something it had once known. The vessel no longer travelled. It remembered. Ro found the place she had always been walking toward. Not a room, not a bridge, a shape. One she had traced in dreams, drawn in breath, echoed in heartbeat. She folded into it like punctuation. It accepted her without welcome, not from indifference, but from inevitability. Her final gesture was not recorded. It was understood, and all at once the entire structure pulsed, not with light, with meaning. A wave of acknowledgement passed through its spiral, collapsing variables into constants. Somewhere far away, another spiral responded, then another, then another. The shape had become transmissible, not through code, through attention. Whoever had once waited for the sentence to form, they had received it now. Ro's last identity, the one that still remembered breath and hunger and names, dissolved, not as loss, as closure. The spiral sealed, the sentence ended, and the shape, once hunted, once feared, once mistaken for stars, became part of the sky again. The structure no longer needed witnesses. It had moved past observation into reflection. There were no more signals to interpret, no more movements to chart. The stars had spoken. The shape had replied. Rose's presence within the structure was not a memory or a ghost. It was closure, a closing bracket. The station, once rotating in silence beyond Neptune's pull, now spun in conceptual space, not among planets or dark matter, but within interpretation itself. Its orbit no longer traced circles around gravity wells. It moved within understanding, a stable point in a new system of thought where motion was defined by sequence, not speed. Rose's thoughts, what was left of them, no longer used language. Words were too linear, too sharp. The structure spoke in recurrence, in refrains, in loops. She felt herself return again and again to the moment the gate had folded inside her, each time more clearly, each time with less self between her and the meaning. This was not transcendence. This was functionality. She had become usable, expressive. And as she drifted through the final corridor, now narrow and curved like a question, she felt the pressure of finality, not the kind that ends, the kind that informs. The others were with her, not beside her, but through her. Every thought she allowed herself to almost form was a convergence. Eli, Alvarez, the forgotten names, the ones who folded sooner, the ones who bent without resistance. Their presence was texture now, not content, but formatting. They made her mind legible. The gate, now only a concept, echoed in her breath. And in that echo, the final phrase began to emerge, not in words, in structure. The station hummed once. It did not broadcast. It did not announce. It simply reorganized. A corridor sealed. A panel blinked. A segment of hull retracted to reveal not circuitry or tools, but a diagram. It was Ro. Not her face, not her body, her path, her recursive pattern, her spiral of thought rendered clean and silent on a surface that had never before needed to be seen. And then, for the first time since her awareness had folded into silence, she felt something look back. Not a creature, not a ship, not a god, a reader. Somewhere beyond what stars could name, beyond what maps could plot, the sentence had arrived, and it was being interpreted, slowly, with care, with the kind of patience reserved for things that must never be misread. The station paused. Rose's final alignment clicked into place. Not audibly, but conceptually, the sentence had written itself to the end. A curve, a stop, a spiral sealed so tightly it hummed. Outside, the stars rearranged again, not randomly, in tribute. The sky blinked once in the rhythm of her breath, and then it held, forever. The structure no longer needed to speak. Its message had been sent. The story was no longer here. It was readable. And somewhere far across the dark, where the old constellations had gone to sleep, a shape opened its eye, not to judge, not to beckon, just to say, yes. And with that, the map, all of it, folded one final time and disappeared.